What's going on, guys? Welcome to the video, and today I have for you a Lightroom editing tutorial on how to quickly edit your sunset landscape images in Adobe Lightroom. So without further ado, let's not waste any time. Let's hop right into it and open up Lightroom and see what we're working with. Okay, so first things first, if you want to follow along with the images that I'm going to be editing in this tutorial, I will leave a download link in the description below, so you can have access to these 3 images that I took out in the fields of a beautiful beach in Spain called Cabadanque. Highly recommend it if you're ever in the Murcia region of Spain. It's my favorite beach and it's beautiful. These are the 3 images that I took, and the reason why it's 3 instead of 1 is because I used the exposure bracketing technique, where I took 3 images of different exposure values so I can blend them together in Lightroom. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So once you have your 3 photos loaded into your library in Lightroom, what you want to do is highlight by holding Shift and clicking on all 3. Right click and go into Photo Merge HDR. And that is going to blend your 3 images together. And this is the blend that Lightroom has set up for you. So if you're happy with it, which I am, you are going to click Merge down here, and it takes a second to merge all 3 of the photos to create a different file. And this is the file that we are going to be working with. So take this photo into the Develop module. Shortcut for that is just by hitting the D button on your keyboard when you're in the Library module. And here we are. So this is what we are going to be working with. The first couple steps that I usually take before I start editing is go into Lens Corrections and click Remove Chromatic Aberration and enable Profile Corrections. And then I like to straighten out my image, and by clicking Level, there we go. So we're looking nice and straight, and liking how our composition is starting there. Next, I go into the Basic tab, where I get my exposure values right, adjust the highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, clarity, all that good stuff. So let's run through the Basic tab real quick. So let's bring up our exposure to about +50. Contrast, not too much. I usually like to add most of my contrast through different methods using the tone curve, etc. So let's leave our contrast value at +8. Bring down the highlights a little bit to recover some of the detail in the sky. Bring up the shadows a little bit. And we're gonna leave our shadows at +46 for now. Bring up the whites to about 24, and then down with the blacks to -24. All right, next in the clarity section, I usually like to bring down my clarity when I have a photo like this shooting directly into the light. Bringing down my clarity a little bit, not too much. You can overdo it. It usually gives you that nice airy Orton effect sort of look. But again, I like to have it pretty subtle and not too much. So I'm gonna bring down my clarity to around -20 there. And at the same time, I'm gonna bring up the texture a little bit. Vibrance, I don't usually mess around with vibrance too much, but I'm gonna leave it at +6. And then before we go any further, I have to remove this ugly lens spot that I did not notice at first. So go into the spot removal tool, and I will click on that lens spot, and Lightroom will magically get rid of it. It's gone. We never have to see it again. All right, cool. So next, I want to go into my tone curve and bring down some of the low ends, bring back up some of the mid-tones. All right, and bring back down the highlights. So we're using that classic S curve on the tone curve adjustments. Maybe bring down the top ends of the highlights just by bringing down the dot on the top right hand corner, and then bring up the blacks by dragging up this dot in the lower left hand corner to about 12. Now I'm gonna go back into the basic tab and maybe boost up the shadows a little bit. All right, cool. So our shadows are at plus 56 and I'm liking what we have there. So let's take a look at our before and after so far. So there's a couple of ways to do that, shortcuts on the keyboard. I like to use Y. That gives you a before and after comparison. Liking what we're doing so far here. And also you could use the backspace on your keyboard. Backspace brings it into before. And if you hit it again, it brings it back to what you're working with on the edit. So before, after. Nice. All right, next I want to add some masks. So I am going to use a radial gradient on our light source, which in this case is this bright sunburst right directly in the photo. And what I usually do in this case is boost up the exposure a little bit. The goal here is to really emphasize the light and to make it a little bit more dramatic and airy. So to do that, we're gonna make a radial gradient mask and boost up the exposure a little bit to about 40. Let's boost up the highlights a tiny bit, maybe to 9-ish. And then this really makes a world of difference playing with the dehaze and bringing it down, maybe not that much, to about -28. And lastly, I am going to warm up this mask, bring up the temperature a little bit, and not too much, to about 40. Let's have a look at our before and after, just so you can see the difference that that mask made. So before, after. Liking what we did there. So next I want to add a new mask for the sky. So go to create new mask, select sky, and shout out to Adobe for making these mask selections super easy and streamlined. Let's bring down the exposure for our sky a little bit to -24, and maybe our highlights a tiny bit. All right. That's about it. I'm not going to do too much to change the sky. I'm liking how it's looking so far. Let's do a before and after for both of those masks. Before, after. All right, liking what we're doing with that. Now let's go into our color grading. Now that we have our shadows and our exposure relatively where we want it, the next step I usually do is to go into my color adjustment. So color grading, I'm gonna add some orange to our midtones, warm up the image overall, and contrast that with some blue shadows down to about 15 on the saturation and 224 on the hue for the shadow. And then on the highlights, don't need to do too much because we already warmed up the highlights significantly with the radial gradient mask, but let's add a little bit of saturation to the highlights there, boost up the blending, and leave the balance right in the center there. Cool, so let's take a look at the before and after on the color grade. Very subtle, but I'm liking the difference that it's making. So before, after. And what I like to do next is after my color grading, I go into the calibration tool, and I personally like to, when I have a sunset, a lot of oranges and yellows, I like to change my oranges to a sort of more reddish hue and my yellows to a more orangish hue. That's just my personal style, so take that into account, but to each his own there. So let's bring down the blue hues and leave that right there to -20. And let's boost up the greens to a darker green. And you see that, and you see the effect that has overall on the colors in your image. The calibration tool can make a world of difference when it comes to making color adjustments. Let's bring down the hue on our red a little bit to -4. And for our tints, I want to add a little bit of magenta to the shadow. Nice. All right, before and after on the calibration. Before and then after. All right, I think we maybe went a little overkill on the red, so I'm going to bring the red back to 0 on the hue. I'm not going to touch the red. All right, liking how that's looking so far. The colors are looking great for me. I don't need to do too much on the color adjustments in the HSL tab, but I will open it up and boost the oranges a little bit. And maybe boost the yellows a little bit on the saturation. Luminance, purple luminance. Maybe boost the purple a little bit on the luminance. But other than that, I am thinking our colors are looking just right, and I don't need to do too much to adjust it. Yeah, maybe play with the yellows and oranges a little bit further, but just very, very subtle. Yeah. All right, last but not least, what I would need to do is to do an object selection on the rocks in the foreground, because right now they're very silhouetted and you don't really see any detail in the rocks. And I want to change that by doing some selective adjustments. So I am going to utilize the object mask selection. And if you haven't used this before in Lightroom, it's very handy. Super easy to select things like trees, rocks, houses, anything like that. All you need to do is draw over the object that you want selected, and there you have it. So you can see this is the selection that you're going to be editing. Let's bring up the exposure tiny bit to 26. Boost the highlights to 40. And let's warm the temperature a little bit. So the idea here with this object selection mask on the rocks in the foreground is to really emphasize the effect that the light is having on these objects here. And we're doing that by warming up the rocks overall, bringing up the exposure, playing with the highlights, and maybe boosting the shadows. Not too much, but a little bit there. To 5. Now, next, what I can do is duplicate that mask to the other rocks in the foreground on the right-hand side right here. And how you do that is super simple. All you need to do is add to mask with, objects, and do the same exact thing. Just color over the rocks that you want selected, and Lightroom will automatically apply those adjustments that you made for the previous rock or object to the new objects that you just selected. So there you have it. So you can see before and after on the object selection for the rocks before, and then after. All right, maybe bring down the shadows a little bit to 0. All right, cool. All right, I am really liking what we did so far in this edit, and I think we're pretty much finished. So let's take a look at the before and after. Hit Y on our keyboard and hit backspace on our keyboard. Before, after. Last thing we can do is to add a little vignette, of course. 10, bring up the midpoint, the feather a little bit before, after on the vignette. And let's crop in our photo overall. So hit the R button on your keyboard for the crop shortcut, and let's crop it down so our horizon is not directly in the middle horizontally. Let's bring it down just a tad, and there we have it, guys. All right, let's go into our full screen. Hit the F button on your keyboard. That's a great shortcut if you want to take in your edit and sit back and marvel at the beautiful masterpiece that you just created in Lightroom. All right, there you have it, guys. Thank you so much for tuning into the video. Hope you guys picked something up. Hopefully you learned some new techniques that you could apply to your editing style. And with that said, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.